At 3:18 in the morning, while most of Atlanta was asleep, a junior records analyst named Elena Marsh sat alone inside the records compliance office of the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles. Her overnight shift was nearing its end. The building was quiet and her task was routine, reviewing parole files and verifying records before they were archived. One file in particular caught her attention. It belonged to Damon Reeves, a 41-year-old inmate who had been serving a 22-year sentence for trafficking and criminal conspiracy. 8 months earlier, Reeves had been granted early parole. On paper, the decision seemed justified. The file included positive rehabilitation reports, a clean disciplinary history, and a community reintegration plan prepared by a private contractor. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. However, Elena had developed a habit during her first year on the job. Although not required by official policy, she routinely checked whether recently released inmates had been rearrested after leaving prison. When she ran that cross-reference on Reeves, she discovered that only 4 months after being released, he had been arrested again. The new charges were alarming: trafficking, criminal conspiracy, illegal possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. And at first, Elena assumed it was simply another case of recidivism. Unfortunately, former inmates sometimes returned to crime. But when she looked deeper into the arrest report, she noticed that Reeves had been arrested alongside 2 other recently paroled offenders. Curious, she pulled their files. Both men had received early release approvals. Both had been serving sentences for similar organized crime offenses. Both had returned to criminal activity shortly after their release. And every single parole authorization carried the same signature: Reginald Crane, chairman of the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles. Elena continued searching. 1 file became 3, 3 became 10, 10 became 23. By 5:46 that morning, she had identified 23 separate cases showing the exact same pattern. Inmates convicted of serious organized crime offenses had received early release and then quickly returned to criminal activity. The same chairman's signature appeared on every authorization. The pattern disturbed her enough that she filed an internal escalation report. She also copied investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Public Integrity Unit. Within hours, the report was moving through law enforcement channels. By 10 a.m., state investigators had begun reviewing the information. By 2 p.m., federal authorities were quietly examining years of parole records. What Elena Marsh had discovered during a routine overnight audit would soon expose one of the largest corruption investigations ever connected to a state parole system. The following day, FBI analysts launched a massive review of parole board decisions covering nearly a decade. The Georgia Parole Board processed thousands of cases every year, creating an enormous volume of records. When investigators completed their first major review, the results were shocking. They identified thousands of parole decisions involving inmates connected to organized criminal enterprises, including trafficking networks, racketeering operations, money laundering groups, and armed robbery organization. The numbers did not match historical patterns. These offenders were being granted early release at rates significantly higher than expected. Even more concerning, many of them were returning to criminal activity shortly after leaving prison. Investigators discovered that a large percentage of these parole approvals shared one specific internal authorization code. It shared -exec-3. The designation represented a chairman-level executive override. Only one person possessed that authority: Reginald Crane. Records showed that the unusual pattern began shortly after Crane became chairman of the parole board. As investigators expanded their review, attention quickly shifted from the parole decisions themselves to the possibility of financial corruption. The next phase focused on money. Federal financial analysts began tracing payments connected to individuals who had received favorable parole outcomes. What they found was an elaborate network designed to hide the movement of funds. The money did not flow directly into personal bank accounts. Instead, investigators uncovered a maze of shell companies registered across multiple states and offshore jurisdictions. The companies appeared legitimate on paper, but showed little evidence of actual business activity. As agents followed the financial trail, they arrived at a private consulting firm operating from an office in Atlanta's Buckhead district. And the company was called Sentinel Reform Strategies. Publicly, it appeared insignificant. Privately, investigators believed it played a central role in the operation. Corporate records linked the company to Marcus Halverson, a former corrections and criminal justice official with decades of experience inside both federal and state systems. Halverson understood parole procedures better than almost anyone, and he'd spent years helping design policies, review protocols, and risk assessment systems used throughout the criminal justice process. According to investigators, that expertise became the foundation of the alleged scheme. Federal agents later claimed that Halverson knew exactly which inmates could be presented as ideal parole candidates. He understood how rehabilitation reports were evaluated. He knew how audit systems worked. Most importantly, he knew where oversight mechanisms were weak. Investigators recovered encrypted communications that allegedly revealed his role. Inside those communications, Halverson reportedly operated under a code name. The counselor. According to prosecutors, his job was not to approve parole directly. Instead, he allegedly helped construct the paperwork necessary to make questionable releases appear legitimate. Every recommendation looked reasonable. Every report appeared professional. Every release could be justified on paper. One recovered message allegedly summarized the strategy perfectly. The board does not need to be wrong. The board needs to be reasonable. We give them reasonable on paper, the decision follows. As evidence accumulated, federal authorities moved quickly. Search warrants were approved for multiple locations across Georgia. Agents simultaneously targeted the parole board headquarters, private residences, consulting offices, and several businesses connected to the investigation. When agents entered parole board offices, they seized computers, storage devices, financial records, and internal documents. At Reginald Crane's residence, investigators reportedly recovered large amounts of cash, precious metals, offshore banking records, and encrypted communication devices. At Sentinel Reform Strategies, agents discovered active computer systems and digital archives that investigators believed contained years of operational records. The investigation expanded rapidly. What initially appeared to be a small collection of suspicious parole decisions now looked like a highly organized operation spanning nearly a decade. Federal analysts worked around the clock processing data recovered from servers and storage devices. Inside those records, investigators allegedly found detailed financial ledgers, communication logs, shell company ownership structures, and records of parole decisions connected to criminal organizations. The evidence suggested a system designed to move influential members of criminal networks out of prison years before their sentences were complete. By the end of the operation, dozens of individuals had been arrested or detained for questioning. But investigators say the most disturbing aspect of the case was not the money. It was the impact on public safety. Authorities reviewed criminal activity linked to inmates who had received suspicious early release approvals. Their findings painted a troubling picture. Many of the released offenders had allegedly returned to criminal organizations shortly after leaving prison. Some resumed leadership positions, and others became involved in trafficking operations, weapons offenses, robberies, and violent crimes. Investigators linked hundreds of criminal incidents to individuals whose releases were now under review. For victims and their families, the revelations were devastating. The parole system exists to evaluate rehabilitation and determine when an offender can safely return to society. According to investigators, that trust may have been compromised. Every release had been presented as a legitimate administrative decision. Every approval carried official authorization. Every file appeared normal, and yet behind those documents, authorities alleged that financial incentives influenced outcomes that should have been based solely on public safety and rehabilitation. As investigators examined the operation more closely, they discovered another troubling detail. The parole board's standard review system automatically flagged rearrests occurring within only 30 days of release. Many of the offenders connected to the investigation were rearrested after that 30-day period expired. As a result, they avoided triggering certain review mechanisms. Ironically, years earlier, Marcus Halverson himself had reportedly recommended extending that review period. The recommendation was never adopted. According to prosecutors, the alleged operation later benefited from the exact weakness he once identified. Today, the case continues to serve as a powerful reminder of how vulnerable complex government systems can become when oversight fails. What began as a routine overnight audit by a single analyst eventually triggered a federal investigation involving financial crimes, organized criminal networks, and allegations of corruption reaching the highest levels of a state parole board. And it all started because one employee noticed a pattern that everyone else had overlooked. A pattern hidden inside ordinary paperwork. A pattern buried within thousands of routine decisions. A pattern that, according to investigators, exposed years of corruption operating in plain sight. The question investigators continue to ask is simple. If a network this sophisticated could allegedly function undetected for years inside a critical public institution, how many other weaknesses remain hidden inside systems that millions of people trust every day? People trust